proud to have Peter Balakian here tonight, presenting his lecture on the Armenian Genocide and America's first international human rights movement. His most recent book, The Burning Tigers, a national and New York Times bestseller, was a New York Times Notable Book of 2003 and one of Publishers Weekly's Best Books of 2003. The New York Times Book Review described the book as timely and welcome, an overwhelmingly convincing retort to genocide deniers. The Burning Tigers succeeds in resurrecting a little-known chapter of American history and also underscores a crucial point about humanitarian responses to violations of human rights. The Boston Globe observes, The Burning Tigers tells a story of multiplying horror and betrayal. By reintroducing the voices of Americans who spoke up for the Armenians a century ago, Balakian honors the international human rights tradition in the United States. What happened to the Armenians in Turkey was a harbinger of the Holocaust and of the waves of modern mass murder that have swept the world ever since. As a side note, the book, The Burning Tigers, will be available outside after the lecture for signing and sale. Along with The Burning Tigers, Mr. Balakian is the author of 7 previous books, including the memoir Black Dog of Fate, which won the 1998 PEN Martha Albrun Prize for the art of the memoir, and was a New York Times Notable Book, as well as Best Books of the Year for the Los Angeles Times and Publishers Weekly. His June Tree, New and Selected Poems, 1974 to 2000, received critical acclaim in the New York Times Book Review and TLS. Mr. Balakian's honors and awards include a Guggenheim Fellowship, a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Anna Haidt Literary Prize, and an Ellis Island Medal of Honor. He has appeared widely on national television and radio, including ABC World News Tonight, The Charlie Rose Show, Terry Gross's Fresh Air, NPR's Weekend Edition, C-SPAN, and CNN. Mr. Balakian is a Donald M. and Constant H. Rebar Professor of the Humanities and Professor of English at Colgate University, where he was the first director of Colgate Center for Ethics and World Societies. Please join me in welcoming him to Boston College.
Thank you, Hirag. Can you hear me okay? I want to make sure how about this, just talking? Everything's okay, great. Hirag, thank you for all the work you've done and the Armenian Club has done. All the attending sponsors of this event, I appreciate the work that's gone into this. And especially I want to thank Laura Tanner of your English department, my former brilliant student, and now your even more brilliant professor of English. Laura, thank you for everything. The details, putting any event together can be overwhelming sometimes. So it's good to be here. And as we push into April, it's a special month on the Armenian calendar. Those of you in the audience who come from the Armenian community know that April is the month Armenians worldwide commemorate the beginning of the Armenian Genocide. April 24 is the exact date that commemorations happen worldwide. So I feel there's a kind of prologue to that being here tonight. I mean, it'll be April tomorrow. And if you keep me here long enough, it'll be April tonight. What I would like to do in about 48 minutes is introduce 4 large domains of this history, and in a sense, as they emerge from my recent book. I have about 45 images that I think will work well with the issues I want to explore with you. And I'm interested as well. I'm going to have to figure out the best way to manage this. All right. If it falls apart, we're stuck with whatever image is up there. It's okay. I'm interested as well in thinking about reclaiming this history, because this is a large and important history for the 20th century, and it's a history that's been lost. It's been left out. It hasn't been properly included. And so I sort of want to think along those lines with you as students, as teachers, as members of communities about reclaiming histories, about the reclamation of this history, where it belongs belongs in the curriculum, how it gets taught in the curriculum, why it gets taught in the curriculum. Let me start by suggesting some answers to that question. Why does this belong in the curriculum? Why does this matter, this history that belongs to the first part of the 20th century and got lost somewhere along the way? First, I would note that the Armenian Genocide is a landmark event. It changed history. It was unprecedented. It began the age of modern genocide. And I underline the word modern because, of course, genocide is as old as recorded history. We can go back to the classical world, to the ancient Hebraic world, and find episodes of genocide. We know, I'm sure, that our own country is built on genocide. The genocide of the Middle Passage, which took the lives of 50 to 60 million Africans, the genocide of the Native Americans, which eradicated close to 15 million Native Americans. So we're not strangers to that notion, and we have to own up to the blood that's at the source of this culture as well. But when we talk about modern genocide, we're talking about something that belongs to the era of the modern nation state, in which a government uses its bureaucracy, its military, its state apparatus for the purpose of isolating, targeting, scapegoating, and eliminating a specific culture or ethnic group in a concentrated period of time. And the first time that that happened in modern history was to the Armenian people at the hands of the Ottoman Turkish government in 1915, World War I, not yet a year old. So it seems to me that no history of the 20th century can be told without telling the history of the Armenian Genocide, and certainly no history of World War I can adequately be told without an understanding of how and why the plan to exterminate the Armenian people in Turkey was carried out behind the screen and cover of the Great War. I would argue that the Armenian Genocide belongs to World War I in the same way that the Holocaust belongs to World War II. And now certainly it seems to me that no American history is complete without understanding how and why the movement to rescue and save the Armenian people, first from massacre in the 1890s at the hands of Sultan Abdulhamid II. You'll see his picture up there in a minute. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then from genocide in 1915 became America's first international human rights movement. That's part of the topic of my recent book, and it's part of what I want to talk about today. In the history of modern international law and human rights, it's important to remember that the Allies, in May of 1915, World War I not yet a year old, made a pointed statement to the Ottoman government, warning Turkey that if the massacres of the Armenians continued, that Turkey would be held responsible for, and here's the new phrase, crimes against humanity. The first time that phrase is used is in May of 1915, in the wake of the first phase of the Armenian massacres. Sixthly, Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish jurist and legal scholar who invented the term genocide, did so in part on the basis of what had happened to the Armenians in 1915, and of course on the basis of what was happening to the Jews in Europe right before his very eyes. So the Armenian event is inextricable from the very origin of the term genocide. It's part of its etymology. It's in a way eponymous. And many of you know the famous, now I think somewhat famous quote by Adolf Hitler, made 8 days before invading Poland in 1939, who today, after all, speaks of the annihilation of the Armenians. And Hitler was inspired, of course, by the fact that the Young Turk government had gotten away in some way, had committed genocide with impunity against its Armenian population. And he was also inspired by the fact that what had been the largest international human rights crisis, disaster, catastrophe of the second decade of the 20th century had virtually fallen down the amnesia hole only 20 years later, by 1939. And Hitler's statement reminds us, of course, that memory is a moral issue. Memory has a moral role to play. The Armenian genocide then, in some sense, became a template for the major genocidal episodes that would follow: the Holocaust, Pol Pot's genocide in Cambodia, the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, and successive and episodes that have followed that may or may not be genocide in the legalistic sense, but it doesn't matter. They are major human rights catastrophes. What's happening in Darfur now, what happened in the Balkans in the late 90s, these events, again, remain part of the bloody stream of genocidal violence going back to 1915. Now, let me turn to the pictures here. And you see the part of the world we're looking at. You see the dark red line, which outlines a piece of historic Armenia in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire, the historic Armenian provinces. If you can draw a line to the south and west of the yellow area, even the lined out yellow area, and come down around Lake Van, the most southwesterly of the big lakes on that map, and pull along the southern Turkish border and along that western red line, you get a sense of the part of the world we're talking about. And you can also see that Armenia was divided, historic Armenia was divided between two empires, the Russian and the Ottoman Turkish. And this, of course, would play out in the drama and the tragedy of the fate of the Armenian people. People often ask, and I think it's important, and the more we can see of the world before the catastrophe, the better. So I have a few images here of what it looked like over there before massacre and genocide eradicated Armenia and the Armenian people from their historic provinces. Oops, not that way. There we go. So there is an image of the Armenian quarter in Harpert in the late 19th century. You can see the dome over the kind of heavy square building in the middle of the church, and you see those houses built out of native stone in rocky and dramatic highlands. Actually, this is mislabeled. It's not Harpert, it's Bitlis, so it's further east and even more rocky and dramatic. I have to change that caption, excuse me. But there you go with another image of historic Armenia in those rocky eastern Anatolian highlands, today Turkey. Now, an image of the Sultan is important to lay our eyes on, and I want to say something about the why question. What led to the Turkish government's plan to want to eradicate an entire ethnic population from its historic homelands? Briefly here, and this is a lecture, that's too brief, but and we will have Q&A afterwards, so I can try to answer questions and fill in gaps as best I can in the time we have. But what happened? What happened to the Armenians living in Ottoman Turkey in the late 19th century? I think it's important to understand that it's important to understand first that Christians and Jews, non-Muslim minorities in the Ottoman Empire, were legally designated infidels, non-believers. And they were subject to a different social, economic, political structure. Christians, for example, were not allowed to join the military. They were not allowed to own weapons. They were not allowed to be employed by the civil service. They were infrastructurally removed from the power zones, if you will. They had no legal rights in Islamic courts of law. That's important. They had no legal rights in Islamic courts of law. They were taxed heavily by a notoriously corrupt tax farming system, and this often fleeced in this case, the Armenian agrarian community. I would remind you that Armenians weren't the only minorities living in the Ottoman Empire. The Greeks, the Assyrians, the Syrian Christians made up the bulk of the rest of the Christian population of the empire. There was a smaller population of Jews, and there were large populations of Arabs and Kurds, all who had different, complicated, and unhappy fates. But the Armenians began to protest in the late 19th century for change. And in the broadest sense, let me just note that life, liberty, and property were not secure. Property was extorted frequently through the tax system and the Islamic court system. Women were raped, abducted into harems regularly. Life, liberty, and property were not secure. The lives of Christian women in the Ottoman Empire would make a very good dissertation and a very good book. So Armenians began to protest for change in the late 19th century. They began to petition. They began to rally. They formed political parties. They didn't engage in violence. They didn't own weapons. They weren't an armed people. They had no government. They had no empowering apparatus of that sort. But they began to agitate for change. I would liken it to a civil rights movement. And they began to push the political envelope by asking the question of the Sultan and his government and Turkish culture at large, can a Christian be the equal of a Muslim in the Ottoman Empire? For me, that's the fundamental question being asked in the late 19th century by the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. And the answer to that question was repeatedly no, and the no was meted out in wholesale violence. Now, after an uprising on the Eastern Plateau in a region called Sassoon, where Armenian farmers refused to pay taxes after the fifth time of extortion, the fifth time around in that month of April, it was actually, of 1894. They refused to pay taxes, and fighting broke out. And, you know, it's interesting to think about the role of economics in revolution or in dissidence and protest. Think about our own American Revolution. Fighting broke out after the refusal to pay taxes in Sassoon in 1894, and within months, the Sultan, Abdülhamid II, you see him here at his moment of coming to power in 1876, the Sultan sent in his private army to implement wholesale massacre on an innocent civilian population. More than 5,000 people were wiped out in the Sassoon massacre of 1894. Before it was over, in the mid-1890s, more than 200,000 Armenians would be wiped out in a period called the period of the Hamidian massacres, as they were known. Abdülhamid II became known as the Bloody Sultan, or the Red Sultan, Sultan Rouge, as Clemenceau called him, the Bloody Sultan, as Gladstone called him. The Hamidian massacres, in a way, really were a shot heard around the world. There was an extraordinary, and I remind you, this is unprecedented in modern Western history. 200,000 innocent civilians, unarmed civilians, wiped out, massacred by their government. The response around the world was large. In the United States, it spawned what I argue in my book, what I would call America's first international human rights movement. And that movement began here in Boston. Well, before we get to Boston, I mean, to give you a sense of the coverage of the Hamidian massacres, this from the London Graphic, December 7, 1895. of a mass grave in Erzurum. This is pretty cutting-edge photojournalism. And there was a lot of this in the American and British press. The Armenian massacres of the 1890s had an enormous impact on the growing popular late Victorian press and on the big picture books, the big picture magazines of the era. Remember, we're in an era before television, and these are the big screens, Harper's, The Graphic, and so forth. I'll show you another one from, well, you'll see one from Harper's in a minute as well. Harper's was full of Armenian massacre coverage in the 1890s. So here at Faneuil Hall, a place I assume most of you have been to, that place on Boston Harbor, known affectionately as the Cradle of Liberty, because it was so important to the foment surrounding the American Revolution, so important to the discourse of abolitionism in the 1850s, 40s, and 50s, so important to the women's suffrage movement in the second half of the 19th century. So how appropriate that at Faneuil Hall on the last Monday of November of 1894, the Monday before Thanksgiving that year, a group of Boston intellectuals and cultural leaders would rally a packed Faneuil Hall, several thousand people jamming the hall, led by the eminent social critic, writer, feminist, women's suffrage leader, Julia Ward Howe. Julia Ward Howe was the first president of the United Friends of Armenia. She gave the last decades of her life to the Armenian movement. And with her that night, and she was in her early 70s at this point, so you can get a sense of, you know, today's 70 is nothing, right? But 70 in 1894, you know, maybe tabulates to 97, right? But I'm just joking, but you get the sense of how hardy and feisty people like Julia Ward Howe were at that point in their lives. She was surrounded by Alice Stone Blackwell, Lucy Stone's daughter, William Lloyd Garrison Jr., Isabel Barrows, June Barrows, Governor Greenelge, and others. And the movement that night really catapulted what would unfurl over 4 decades as an international human rights movement focused on rescue, relief, proposals for intervention, and enormous NGO philanthropic giving in the wake of the atrocities, the Armenian atrocities. Before it was over, some of America's most distinguished voices, Stephen Crane, Mark Twain, Henry and William James, Henry Adams, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Ezra Pound, H.L. Mencken, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and others would speak out and write passionately and often quite wittily and profoundly about what was happening to the Armenian people 8,000 miles away. Clara Barton, Alice Stone Blackwell, The Woman's Journal, which she published here in Boston, is probably the best record of the Armenian massacres of the 1890s that there is in the popular press. It's an extraordinary record, and I spent a lot of time with the Woman's Journal, but if some of you interested in this might want to go and keep digging in it. Clara Barton, we all know her as the mother of the Red Cross, the founder of the Red Cross, the angel of the battlefield, as she was known for her work during the Civil War. Clara Barton took the first Red Cross mission ever out of the United States in February of 1896 to the killing fields of the Armenian provinces of the Ottoman Empire. And again, this woman in her early 70s to take 5 Red Cross teams 6,000 to 8,000 miles away into a country that, as she entered it, had banned her in the Red Cross. And there's a section in my book that I hope you'll find, decent drama where she talks circles around the Turkish foreign minister, Tufik Pasha, and convinces him to let her and the Red Cross into the country to help the Armenians. The Red Cross mission I really see as a kind of proto-Peace Corps mission. The Red Cross in the Armenian provinces in the 1890s was helping the Armenian people rebuild its agrarian infrastructure. There was a sense that there was a future here, that this was not over, that this was a crisis that would pass. So we have the Barton story, which is extraordinary, I think. This was a grassroots movement, this Armenia human rights movement. It involved synagogues, churches, Lions clubs, Kiwanis clubs, Rotary clubs, Sunday school picnics, elementary school, lemonade stand drives, and so forth. I write about this culture of philanthropic relief in the second half of my book. And it was, of course, also propelled by major industrialists and tycoons, the Rockefellers, Carnegies, the Mellons, the Fords. They gave in large ways to the Armenia relief movements of the 1890s and then of 1915. Near East Relief came into being in 1918, near the end of World War I, but it had begun in 1915 as the American Committee on Armenian Atrocities. Near East Relief, which was focused on, as the epithet went, the starving Armenians. Near East Relief gave, before it was over, more than $110 million in an age when a loaf of bread cost a nickel. So you can get a sense of the kind of giving that came out of American culture. If you tabulate that by today's standards, you come to something like $1.3 billion, and no NGO philanthropical foundation has ever equaled that. The coverage, as I was mentioning, in the press. Well, let's push on with some of our images. There's Julia Ward Howe at the time of the Faneuil Hall meeting. An image from Harper's. There were, in the end, hundreds of images of the Armenian atrocities in the political satiric cartoon Punch in London. And here is one, as the Young Turks have come to power and Europe is telling them, you must stop massacring Armenia. You can see the image of Armenia there in the eastern hinterlands. I'm not going to have time to talk about the Adana massacres of 1909, but simply perhaps as we move through this image to say that the Sultan was deposed in 1908 and a revolutionary movement came to power known as the Young Turks. And the Young Turks were promising liberal change and reform. They were greeted with joy and jubilation by the minority peoples of the Ottoman Empire. The Armenians supported the Young Turks passionately. And the Young Turks came to power hoping to bring about some reform. But within 9 months already, another Armenian massacre had happened, this time in Adana, near the Mediterranean, in the south-central province called Adana, with a capital city by the same name. And here you have some images from the Adana massacres. The writing was on the wall. And I guess one of the points I make in The Burning Tigers is that genocide doesn't happen overnight. It evolves slowly over the course of decades as a minority people become increasingly dehumanized, marginalized, and devalued. And the ruling or majority culture comes to feel that way about them, so that before, at some point, at some threshold moment, the unthinkable can happen. Some of these images are gruesome, but that is the face of massacre. Now, before I come to the World War I moment and the implementation of the plan to eradicate the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire, let me just swing back to where I was to finish up a note about the movement at home in the United States. The media covered the Armenian genocide in an extraordinary way. In 1915 alone, the New York Times published 145 articles on the Armenian massacres and deportations. That's an article every 2.2 days. And some of these were bold, big front-page news stories. And if you compare this with the paltry way the Holocaust was covered, it gives you an interesting perspective on the place of these events in American culture in their time. And of course, the ironic reversal of the legacy of the events in American culture. The Armenian event got lost, and the Holocaust evolved into a powerful discourse, and a discourse that has helped the Armenian genocide discourse a great deal in recent decades. So let me leave that image for a second of the American response with you and turn back across the ocean to the Ottoman Empire on the eve of World War I. And this image here shows the Sheikh ul-Islam calling for a jihad against all of the infidels. Now that Turkey was at war in the Great War, World War I, and you may know that Turkey's World War I ally was Germany. And the German-Turkish alliance is a very interesting one for many reasons, in part because the German ruling elite and military elite brought back with them after World War I knowledge of how the Turkish government had destroyed its Armenian population. And there's no ambiguity about this. The young Nazi party learned a lot from the German diplomatic and military corps as they came back from World War I. And in some cases, German military officers were involved in the Armenian genocide. They had high ranks in the Ottoman Third Army. And one of Hitler's best friends in the young Nazi movement, Max von Erwin Schubner-Richter, the vice consul at Erzurum, wrote hundreds of dispatches about the deportations and massacres in that part of Turkey back to the German Foreign Office. Spookily enough, Schubner-Richter died in Hitler's arms during the Munich Putsch of 1923, and on his death, Hitler said he is the Nazi Party's greatest leader, and we've lost him. So you get some sense of the synergy that's going on between genocidal events, and I think that any serious study of the most abominable human crime, genocide, in the 20th century demands comparative genocide studies. That we need to study Rwanda, we need to study Cambodia, we need to study the Holocaust and Armenia, all in a comparative way. So Turkey and Germany go to war against the Allies in 1914, and the three people who have coalesced power in Turkey and now call themselves the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, are Talat, the Minister of the Interior, who really was the chief architect of the plan to exterminate the Armenians, Enver, the Minister of War, who was trained in Germany and really brokered in some way a lot of the German-Turkish alliance. As the war is on, I mean, these are war cartoons. They are propaganda, and I don't present them as anything other than that. But semiotically, they're interesting, and one could, were we to take these apart in a seminar, we could spend a lot of time talking about how they work as signifying images. But you see the German word Kultur so important to that codification. Again, German culture, and a list of recent war atrocities, and the scimitar, the image of the terrible Turk, and so on. There's certainly some orientalizing going on in the framing and shaping of the discourse surrounding the whole Ottoman Empire. Again, the word culture. Now, let me come, the last big kind of domain I'd like to talk about this evening is the planning and the implementation of the century's first modern genocide, how it was done. I think it's important to understand how meticulously it was done because, as many of you in this room doubtless know, that for the last 9 decades, the Turkish government has been in an assiduous denial of this history. Turkey today spends millions of dollars running a propaganda campaign to try to stop the history of the Armenian genocide from being known, trying to coerce and blackmail foreign governments into ignoring the moral reality of the history, into denying it or colluding with its denial. The U.S. State Department is a hugely culpable in this, although a lot of countries have acknowledged the Armenian genocide in recent years, and for important reasons, for moral reasons and ethical reasons, for a genocide that was done with impunity and is vigorously denied today by the perpetrator legacy. And scholars in genocide studies continue to underscore the following, that the denial of genocide is the final stage of genocide because it seeks to demonize the victims and rehabilitate the perpetrators. And because it sends the message that genocide doesn't matter, that it demands no moral accountability. And of course, genocide done with impunity will only lead to more of the same. So if you listen to the Turkish denials and their aggressive and violent, often rhetoric, you'll hear, at least among the many things you'll hear, is the claim that, well, this wasn't organized by the state. It was something that got out of hand. It happened during World War I. There was a lot of chaos. We don't really know what happened to the Armenians. Somehow 2.5 million Armenians disappeared, but we don't really know what happened to them. And whatever happened to them, they deserve what they got. I mean, you hear that as well in the span of rhetoric that comes out of Ankara today. So it's important to understand how meticulously this was done, and also the kind of template it set for those who would try and succeed in committing genocide in the coming decades of the century. First, the plan was organized by a special bureau of the central government, and the bureau was called the Special Organization, the SO, Teşkilat-i Mahsusa, Special Organization. It was overseen by Minister of the Interior Talat and another high-ranking CUP official, a physician named Dr. Bedahin Shakir. Shakir and Talat, through the SO, created mobile killing squads. Now we know from the history of the Holocaust the important function of the mobile killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen. Here in the Armenian case, we have the same thing. The Chetis, the killing squads, were created by letting out of prison some 30,000 convicts. And as far as I can understand, and if anybody knows more, I'm interested to hear, this is unprecedented, the letting out of prison of some 30,000 convicts for the purpose of a plan of systematic race extermination, to do the dirty work. Secondly, emergency executive legislation was passed, ramrodded through Parliament, through Ottoman Parliament. First, the temporary law of deportation in May of 1915, and secondly, the temporary law of expropriation and confiscation in September of 1915. What did these emergency executive acts of legislation do, they legitimized and expedited massacre and deportation, the two fundamental modes of carrying out the genocidal plan, massacre and deportation. And I'll show you some images of both in a second. Thirdly, I think it's important to understand that technology was used by the Young Turk government. Again, we think of technology as being essential to the Nazi project in its extermination of the Jews of Europe, and it was, and nothing has ever superseded the almost science fiction grotesqueness of Nazi technology, Zyklon gas and crematoria, gas chambers, and unimaginable. But the Turks began the concept in 1915 by using the railway first, the Anatolian Railway and the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, to transport boxcars of Armenian men, women, and children, cattle cars that were built to hold a dozen animals, were stuffed with sometimes 80 to 100 Armenians, and they were sent to the southeast from the west, from places like, I'm going to show you a map in a minute. Maybe I'll show you the map. Let's go to the map. So places from the west down to the southeast. You see the biggest red circle is Deir Zor, the desert in northern Syria, where probably more people died than any other place. The trains would take people down in that direction through Adana and southeastern Kilikia into northwest Syria. But you can see some huge circles, so you can see the epicenters of death in other parts of Turkey. And you can also see that the genocide happened throughout the entirety of Turkey, not just eastern, the entirety of Turkey from Constantinople on. And the telegraph was used as well. We think of the telegraph today as some old, antiquated gizmo, but I would remind you that in its day it was as chic as a laptop. And Talat, the Minister of the Interior, used the telegraph to signal, to communicate orders for massacring and deporting empire-wide. I mean, this is a big span of territory, and the telegraph played an important role. The killing was done town by town, city by city, village by village. Armenians were deported and massacred, arrested in their homes, forced to leave their homes. But first, segments of the population were eliminated systematically. First, the Armenian men in the Ottoman army were disarmed in the winter of 1915 under the pretext that they were untrustworthy, they were seditious, they couldn't be trusted, they might join with the Russians on the other side of the border and help bring down the Ottoman Empire and so forth. I mean, the classic scapegoating rhetoric. They were disarmed and thrown into labor battalions, where they were segregated then, in a very systematic way, and they were systematically mowed down by their fellow Ottoman Muslim soldiers. So the bulk of the able-bodied men are taken care of this way. And then at the massacre, at the deportation moments, many of the men who were still remaining were taken out into the steppe areas of their villages or cities or towns and shot en masse. So the men are eliminated. Then on April 24, that date I mentioned earlier, April 24, more than 250 Armenian intellectuals and cultural leaders were rounded up and arrested in Constantinople on that evening. They were put in buses first and then in trains and sent to the interior, to the Çankırı Armory prison, where before 1915 was over, most of them were tortured and killed. The idea here is, of course, that you cut the head off of the culture. You rip its tongue out. We're talking now the novelists, poets, playwrights, journalists, clergy. All of these people were gotten rid of. And this happened first in Constantinople and then in Harpur. in Diyarbakir, in Erzurum, in Van. The intellectual leadership was rounded up systematically and done away with. In the end, the International Association of Genocide Scholars affirms that over 1 million Armenians perished, 1.2, 1.3, it's hard to know the exact numbers. If you try to tabulate the number of women lost to forced Islamization, harems and so forth, abductions, children as well, and some of the massacres that happened after World War I at places like Marash and Smyrna, you can come to the figure of about 1.5 million, about 2/3 of the Armenian population living on it's important to note that its historic homeland of 2,500 years completely wiped out. Again, some images of the writers. I mentioned the April 24 episode, Krikor Zorab, Daniel Barujan. A whole generation of Armenian intellectuals cut down in their prime. You know, and images are powerful, and that one says a lot. That's the Armenian elite of Harpert being marched out of town. You get a sense, a feel for the texture of the moment, of the process of deportation. This image taken by a German businessman. The Armin T. Wegener photographs are important. He was a German medic in the medical corps serving in Turkey. And he risked his life to smuggle out several dozen images, and they remain among the most important eyewitness images of the century's first genocide. Again, almost an image of so many women on their own. Concentration camps along the Euphrates from northern Syria on early camps. They're not the same kinds of camps you'll see in Auschwitz or Dachau, but they are encampments, and there was no exit. Now, while we have Ambassador Morgenthau's telegram here, this telegram going to William Jennings Bryan, who was then Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, let me close my presentation by swinging back to the American story and talking about the American Foreign Service and its role, its heroic role in the Armenian genocide, because I think this is a story that's way too little known. In the killing fields were dozens of U.S. Foreign Service officers, U.S. consuls, because there was a whole network of consuls from the late 19th century on in the Ottoman Empire. These were ordinary men who had grown up in gay 90s America, peaceful, peacetime America, they were looking to see the wider world and its exotic fruits, the joys of the globe. They found themselves in 1915 in Ottoman Turkey, and as one said, woke up one morning to find scenes more horrible than anything described in Dante's Inferno. That's from Jesse B. Jackson at Aleppo in 1915. These men risked their lives day in and day out, saving and rescuing Armenian men, women, and children. Jesse B. Jackson, for example, a small-town boy from southern Ohio, stationed in Aleppo. Leslie A. Davis, Cornell, class of 1898, had a law degree, practiced journalism for a while, found himself in Harpert in 1915. Oscar Heiser in Trabzon. Edward Nathan in Mersina. William Peter in Samsun. George Horton in Smyrna. They worked tirelessly, saving men, women, and children, rescuing, getting them passage out when possible, protecting their wealth when possible. And they did something more. They wrote. They wrote quite extraordinary dispatches and reports back to their boss, Ambassador Henry Morgenthau, U.S. Ambassador to Turkey from 1913 to 1916, an American Jew who accepted the appointment from Woodrow Wilson in 1913 to take the ambassadorial post. Perhaps no man did more to stand up for justice, to attempt interventions with the German government, with the U.S. government, confrontations with the Young Turk leadership, to try to stop the massacres and the deportations. When he left Turkey in 1916 as persona non grata because of his outspokenness, he recorded in his private journal that Turkey had become a place of unutterable horror for him forever. He went home and he wrote his own story, his memoir, Ambassador Morgenthau's story, and it became the first major narrative in English about the Armenian genocide. It was published by Doubleday in 1918. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies in its day. I'm happy to say it's now reissued in a paperback edition from Wayne State University Press, so you can get it, and it's really an important book. So Morgenthau was receiving these dispatches from the U.S. consuls, and those dispatches today add up to about 4,000 pages of eyewitness account to the century's first genocide, the first diplomatic body of witness literature to genocide, I believe, in certainly in modern history. And you can find them in the National Archives. You'll also find them beautifully written, elegant, vivid, austere, prose that Hemingway would have been proud to claim a decade later. And it reminds us, too, that at an earlier point in our history, people in government could use language with seriousness and depth and power. So let me leave you here, and there's some more images perhaps we can look at before we're done, but let me leave you here with that piece of the American story in the killing fields. Thank you. And I'm, of course, happy to open the floor for questions. Yes.
Going upon what the last statement you said, what is the current Turkey's statement against the memoir? Because I know part of their denial is also his writings and their attitude towards it.
The question is, what is the official Turkish position on Ambassador Morgenthau's memoir, because they've tried to discredit his memoir. Well, you know, deniers, as Deborah Lipstadt, the kind of leading scholar on the Holocaust denial, has noted, that deniers aren't interested in rationality or truth. They're interested in covering something up and distorting and lying about it. So one of the strategies of denial is always to claim that all authentic documents are fakes, are forgeries. Whatever you show a denier, that's the kind of direction that it will go in. I guess the notorious case of Mr. Heath Lowry, who still is teaching at Princeton, sadly, who really worked as an apparatchik for the Turkish government for decades on Armenian genocide denial projects. He wrote a pamphlet trying to discredit Ambassador Morgenthau's memoir. It was published in Istanbul, I believe, the pamphlet, and it was one of the credentials he used to get an endowed chair at Princeton. It's sort of a scandal, and there's more to say about that scandal too. I've written about it, both in my memoir and in this history. I, what to say? I don't want to even legitimize I hate to even talk about Lowry's absurd attacks on Ambassador Morgenthau's memoirs. He claims because Morgenthau had an Armenian secretary that this invalidates the memoir, and he claims because he can't match up everything from Morgenthau's memoir to his personal diary, that therefore the memoir can't be real. I mean, the ignorance and naivete about text is so appalling that it's hard to imagine this man is teaching anybody anything. But so this became a kind of thing that the Turkish state, globbed onto. That, oh, you see, this memoir is not any good. But we expect this from deniers. That's what they do. Yes.
Could you speak about some of the pre-existing conditions, and particularly the prejudices, which may be centuries old, that were used to exploit and then gradually disenfranchise and dehumanize the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire? And were these prejudices also exploited to mobilize Kurdish participation in the genocide?
Right. Did you hear the question? The social and political and cultural formation of dhimmi status, infidel status, is a complicated, it's a very rich history here, and I don't think the history's it hasn't been done adequately until we do social history. One of the things I keep calling for, I'm not an Ottoman historian, and nor am I an Armenologist, but I think people who are really immersed in the field would do well to do some social history on the lives of the minority cultures of the Ottoman Empire. I think the lives of women will yield extraordinary understanding of brutality and violence that has not gotten any attention. It's true that there were parameters in which the minorities could exist in some ways fairly well, as long as they lived in a very narrow alleyway. So if you accepted your subservient status as a Jew, a Christian, or an Arab, again, it's important to understand that this is not only breaking down on Christian-Muslim lines as well. It's really about Turkish ruling power and the conquered minorities. So the Arabs had, profound grievances and pain living under Turkish rule. It's interesting today to note that, Turkey, and this is not meant in any way as totalizing against Turkey. It's simply, I think, a diplomatic truth that Turkey doesn't have any friends among its neighbors, the Syrians, the Iranians, because of the bitterness of the history under Ottoman rule. So once you stepped outside of those parameters, you began to open up an extraordinary Pandora's box, and the Armenians paid hugely for that. I think absolutely the Kurdish population was motivated to join the genocidal assault against the Armenians by the Turkish exploitation of the idea of difference. Christian infidels, disloyal Christian infidels, wealthy merchants. Armenians and Greeks in particular, were stereotyped in ways that the Jews were stereotyped in Europe. They're all parasites. They're traitors. They suck the blood and money out of our system. There's a lot of this rhetoric in Turkish pop, even a little of it I've read in translation in Turkish popular culture of the period. So it reminds us how dangerous it is to essentialize and stereotype, especially a marginalized, powerless culture group. So some reflections on your topic. Yes.
What would you say was like the cutting point where America sort of lost its support for the Armenians? Because they did
America stop supporting the Armenian cause, cease supporting the Armenian cause. My history, my book, tells a story of what I would call gridlock. Because for all of the philanthropic, grassroots, popular human rights movement for the Armenian people that unfurled over 4 decades, you still have a stone wall at the State Department level. The U.S. State Department will never, in the end, intervene. Theodore Roosevelt was furious with Woodrow Wilson for not intervening. In the end, when Woodrow Wilson asked the U.S. Senate to take up what was called the Armenian Mandate, the U.S. mandate for Armenia in 1920, the United States was going to be the shepherding power over this fledgling country. I'm going to show you what Armenia was supposed to look like. Let's move on here. All right, that's the award that Wilson and the Allies gave to Armenia in 1920. Now, you know, the map looks a lot different today. That's a big hunk of what is today northeastern Turkey. When Wilson put that mandate before the U.S. Congress, it was shot down unanimously by isolationist, oil-driven Republicans. I hate to say it because it's replicating history today, but it's true. Cabot Lodge, Harding, Charles Evans Hughes, Herbert Hoover. They were all the new Republican hegemony of the early 20s, you know, the beginning of the Jazz Age. And they were interested in brokering oil in the Middle East, and they wanted to make friends with Turkey, the new Turkish Republic under Ataturk that had come into existence in 1922, 1923. So the turnabout starts then, frankly. And there's always this schizophrenia in our culture, and it's still in our culture. I mean, the Clinton administration in 1994 can't bring itself to use the word genocide to describe what's going on in Rwanda. I mean, so we remain stuck. And I think one of the meanings of Samantha Power's recent book, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, is to call our attention to this gridlock, this stone wall that we can't get beyond in our own foreign policy. So it goes back to the beginning. It's gotten worse in the Cold War era because Turkey and the United States embarked on a deep diplomatic bedfellowship in the wake of Cold War policies and strategic military bases vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And so, you know, those are some reflections on that. Yes? Okay.
Was the economic situation in Turkey similar to what was in Germany at World War II, so that they could villainize a culture?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, you know, that cultures that commit genocide are cultures in hard times and cultures struggling with low self-esteem. Germany in the 1930s, massive depression, huge inflation, you know, the pictures of people wheeling cartons of bills to the bank because money was so meaningless in Germany. Turkey in huge hard times, losing its lands in the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire falling apart, externally and internally, corruption, inflation, debt. Absolutely. Hard times is always one of the ingredients for genocide. Yes?
I have a twofold question. First one is Turkey's desire to enter the EU. How will that play in the direction of their Armenian genocide denial? And what's the end product of genocide denial, reversal of the genocide denial? Or what you think is the product?
The end.
What do you think is the product in the future? What will be the product of the reversal of the Armenian genocide denial?
Excuse me, the first question is about Turkey and the EU. As Turkey seeks EU admission, a lot of noise is being made about the necessity of acknowledging this history before admission, before even accession talks can begin. And of course, the deeper meaning here is that a country that can't engage in critical self-analysis is not a democracy. And the EU, presumably, is an organization of democracies. And of course, not being able to deal with your own criminal past histories, and every country has them, Turkey's not alone, but not being able to deal with them really fits the bloody picture of Turkish human rights abuses today. In other words, these things are connected. Turkey's treatment of its Kurdish minority. Turkey is a place where one can, I think, argue that there have been no minority rights. Minority rights is not a concept that Turkey has acknowledged in the 20th century. Is this a country that can join Europe? A lot of people say it's absurd to think so. How will Turkey reverse its policy on the Armenian genocide? It might have to. The pressure might become such. I think one of the positive signs is that, you know, there are Turkish intellectuals and scholars who are standing up today, speaking out and asking their country to deal with 1915. Recently, the distinguished Turkish novelist Orhan Pamuk has spoken out in the press about the need to come to terms with 1 million Armenians killed in 1915. This was like a bomb dropped in the Turkish press. It caused a lot of uproar. And there's some very brave scholars speaking out. Armenian scholars and Turkish scholars are getting together and acknowledging the history and then moving to analyze it. So there's a lot of positive signs. And as the lie begins to fall apart, there's also going to be more hysteria. So there's going to be more crazy stuff from the right, from the nationalists, and the military. So we'll see how it plays out.
But I was asking more on the lines of what would the end product be? I mean, you know, in terms of money or land or getting our ancient homeland back, you know, things like this.
You know, I appreciate you entrusting me with such prophetic talents, but I can't answer that. I don't know. I don't know what the how conflict resolution will play out on the issue of justice and remuneration and reparation. I don't know. I mean, I think it's something that has to happen a step at a time. And I think, you know, it's a reality process, so one has to expect breakthroughs and then disappointments. I mean, it's not going to be like that, but I don't see how Turkey can maintain the lie too much longer. So I think we'll get to step 1 at some point, and then steps 2, 3, and 4. They'll just have to evolve as they evolve. Yes?
What is it like for the members of the Armenian diaspora in this country that Turkey has maintained its denial? What's the effect?
What is the effect of the denial on Armenians in the diaspora? You know, I think I can't speak for the whole culture, and I don't mean to. So, you know, those of you in the audience that belong to the tribe, I'm not trying to usurp your voice. I'll just give my opinion and my sense of my opinion through having talked with thousands of Armenian Americans over the last decade. You know, I think Armenian diasporan culture is in grief without resolution, is in mourning without resolution. The wound is open. And I think the power of knowledge and education have helped some healing happen. And again, I want to remind you that I want all of us to leave the room tonight thinking about how to teach this in the schools and at Boston College, at your local high school. And I think the teaching of this history is one of the positive arcs of progress in the reclamation of a huge world event. But still, the perpetrator's denial keeps the wound open, and it makes grieving open-ended. And you do need some closure. Not that there's ever real closure to any of these kinds of griefs, but you need to be able to move a little bit forward. And I think we all feel the rage of being trapped to some degree in this Orwellian. It's an Orwellian universe because the perpetrator insists on making a counterfeit universe for itself, and while we don't want it to affect us, in some way it does. Then you have to figure out ways not to let it, as Deborah Lipstadt once put it to me, rob your soul. You can't let it do that. So I find the education world is very therapeutic. I'm going to take one more, and then we'll go out and sign some books, and I'll keep talking on a more individual level with you. Yes?
As far as the Armenian community is concerned, how far do you believe we need to take the fight to actually have the genocide recognized not only in the United States but worldwide? Personally, within the past years, I know this is a 50-50 question, but within the past few years, I've written a couple of petitions, sent them into congressmen and senators, and I believe militarily, the United States, has trouble recognizing it because of our stance with Turkey. Personally, how far do you believe we need to take this?
Yeah, the question is how much energy to put into the U.S. acknowledgement issue. And, the United States and Israel are the two countries that I think are most problematic in colluding with Turkey or acquiescing to Turkish pressure. I think the best approach to social change is education. I think that if you focus on educating people, young boys and girls, and men and women, over the course of a decade, you're going to change popular understanding of this important history. Eventually, denial will disappear because it will be too absurd to maintain. I think if you want to study social change, the African American community holds one of the best examples of persistence and hard work in the face of such violent racism over the course of decades in the country they live in. If you study the evolution of the civil rights movement, you find, these long periods of hard work and education, and then big jumps, breakthroughs, threshold breakthroughs. And the people at the top are the last to get it. It's one of the good things about a democracy, I suppose, although it's frustrating. But the popular culture ends up educating the leaders, and especially the leaders of the future. So, I think people should pursue the recognition issue with the U.S. government as they need to. But I think there's more hope, too, if you think of the bigger picture and the power of education, which is really why, I'm talking to you tonight. And I want you to take this to your community, to your classrooms and your teachers, and start talking about why and where this ought to be taught, and seeing it happen. I'll stop there. Thank you.